All right, we're getting right into it today. We get to chat with one of my personal heroes. He's been a tabletop gamer since playing Dungeons & Dragons as a kid with his dad, and now he's one of the best, most creative, and constantly producing game designers in the field. Greetings, good humans, and welcome to Tabletop Alchemy, where sometimes we get to meet and chat with interesting, creative folks who wander our niche hobby landscape. And we thank our patrons for supporting such adventures and social engagement. First and foremost, I want to thank our guest for taking some time out of his busy schedule to chat with us. Very much appreciated, sir. Mr. Joseph McCullough is a tabletop game designer and author of Frostgrave, Stargrave, Ghost Archipelago, Rangers of Shadowdeep, Oathmark, The Silver Bayonet. Let's meet him. So my first icebreaker question, of course, is always about books and movies. What have you been reading and watching recently, if anything? Because I know you're like swamped.
Actually, reading's quite interesting because about a year ago, I found this list of the 1,000 greatest novels. I think it's like on The Guardian or some newspaper's website. I was really disappointed to find I'd only read 63 of them. So and I thought, man, I thought I was well read. And I mean, obviously, this is just somebody's opinion. So I've been picking out the ones that are most fun that I haven't read and reading them. So what have I read? So I read The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Children of Men, Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. I went to the library, got 4 of them, and that's it. I'm going to increase my numbers. So I read those 4.
It's a good way to start on 1,000. I'm going to get 4. That'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. It was a really short one. So, but actually, they all have something to them. I got to say. Often, I read classics. I mean, these are all kind of genre classics, but classics, and they leave me a bit cold. But I actually really enjoyed all of these. Movie-wise, man, I don't really go to movies. It's too hard when you have kids.
Well, nobody goes to the movies anymore.
Oh,
right?
right,
We
yeah,
just watch everything on streaming, right?
Well, no, even my wife really wants to watch the new Avatar movie, but it's 3 hours long, and we never have 3 hours. And she's like, "Well, we can watch it piecemeal." I'm like, "Yeah, but we also never have 2 consecutive nights, so we'd have to watch 45 minutes, skip 2 nights, watch another 45 minutes." They need to take that movie and turn it into a series.
So speaking of all that, when are we going to get Frostgrave the movie, man?
when somebody shows up at my door with a big pile of money.
All right. Well, when they do, I want my hat out. When they do that, I want to throw my hat in the ring as a potential director or collaborator or something on the filmmaking side. Yep. I just thought of that the other day. I was like, Frostgrave the movie. Oh, I was like, I could see doing a low budget, indie film version of something, just wizard bands fighting out. The only problem is the snow. I would have a problem with that personally, just having to walk around in the snow to make that movie. But I think that would be fantastic. I think it's a great possible franchise or setting and world that would be really cool on the big screen. Yeah. I think it'd be pretty neat. All right. So let's jump into some of the new stuff here, this isn't all new stuff, but your newest game, Silver Bayonet. Why the Napoleonic era? What brought you to that aesthetic?
I guess I knew I wanted to combine historical with Gothic. And then, for me, warfare has no more colorful period than the Napoleonic. You could probably argue a bit earlier, but the uniforms are just so pretty, so colorful and so ornate, and I think that just really contrasts with Gothic horror. It's like here's this soldier with big plumage and gold brocade and shiny buttons, and he's in the shadows, and and there's the werewolf or whatever, and the contrast just really appealed there. You've also got a couple other advantages. It's the last war really last major war where kind of the standard soldier is armed with a firearm, but can't expect to probably get into hand-to-hand combat. From a wargaming perspective, that works really well to have both of those things going on. And from a kind of storytelling point of view, that's a lot of fun. It's really one of the last points before kind of fast communication. You got a while yet before you get telegraph, but but no other kind of major war in Europe before then. So it's a good time to have things going on in the shadows. It's because there's so much chaos and there's so little communication going on. And I've just always wanted an excuse to paint Napoleonic figures. And but I do not want to paint, 30 Fusiliers of the same uniform.
Right. I went with a French war band for Silver Bayonet when I was looking at their uniforms. I was like, oh, they're like 90% white. That doesn't seem like a bright thing, right, to do on the battlefield. But I was kind of tripping out on that. But,
it's also just not fun to paint. It's like, white. Yes. Oh, a little bit white.
I just have a general question for you about, not even general question. I just want your opinion on skirmish games versus role-playing games. Now, I know that you have a background and kind of came up playing like Dungeons and Dragons, right? So, and I'm just, but you make, skirmish games, and I'm just curious about not necessarily why you write skirmish games yourself, but just your own opinion on skirmish games and versus role-playing games or whatever. Do you prefer one to the other nowadays? Or, do you even get to play anymore?
No. But actually, I've made a real effort to play this year, and I've played some games this year. But I think so. I've been doing a lot of work on like kind of my journey as a gamer, and one of the things I realized, and I saw somebody else, Chris Pramis, the big time role play guy, say this, but kind of in the 80s when I really got into gaming, there wasn't really a distinction. Like, you were just a gamer, and like that mostly meant role playing because there was more role playing than anything else. But it also meant you played miniature war games or fantasy board games or anything. You were just a gamer, and those distinctions have become a lot greater over the years, especially as big companies have gotten involved and have a reason to make that distinction. But I personally, most of the time, try not to make that distinction, to the extent where, so I've got a D&D group, and I did a little kind of transition adventure that I wrote myself, and then I was like, man, I should write this in Rangers of Shadowdeep, and then I thought, it doesn't really, because it's got kind of a mystery element to it, it doesn't translate well into a tabletop game. So I actually just wrote it up as an RPG adventure using the Rangers of Shadowdeep rules. And I'll probably release that at some point. But
nice.
And probably marketing wise, that's a terrible idea. It's confusing the message and like, but I don't care because it's just fun to me, and that's what I want to do. I want to game, and I want to tell the right stories, or I want to use the right medium for the stories I want to tell, and not be too bound. So I don't know what your original question was. I might have answered it.
The way you answered that last question, that last statement, really sums up why I enjoy you so much as an author and kind of as a person, just because I've seen you in different interviews and stuff, and just the idea of I don't care, it's cool, I just want to have fun. And you instill that in your books, and that's another thing I really, really like. I like it when I see that blurb, and there's many blurbs throughout your books, right, where you do tell the reader, hey man, have fun. This, don't sweat this stuff. Don't argue about rules. It's cool. Do what is the most fun. Just, I really enjoy that. I think that's very cool.
Which again, I think that's finally old school gamers' attitude that maybe the message hasn't kind of filtered down through the years. So just want to remind people.
Yeah, that's kind of comes back to that corporatization and the big business of everything, right? Where they silo stuff and so they can productize it and everything. And, it's always like on the one hand, it sucks, but on the other hand, you can't fault it because that's the society we want to live in, where, if you have a business, you make some money. And then, of course, anyway, there's always a balance, right? We would do better looking more for the balance. So let's talk a little bit. I'm curious about asking you about game mechanics, and not necessarily specific mechanics in your games. Although I will say that I really, really like the melee combat in Silver Bayonet with the strike back or back off choice. you really did a good job or sort of conjuring the feeling of the repartee of like fencing, right?
Well,
in a broader sense. It's like, yeah, when you get hit in hand-to-hand combat, the other guy is hitting you back at the same time. So I really, really like that. So how much of a like game mechanic scientist are you, or researcher, or like, do you study that sort of stuff? Because I don't have any background in that. I know there are all these different, like,
no,
oh, here's a matrix of how different dies work and the percentages of a die roll and blah, blah, blah. So I'm just curious, like, how much of that do you get into, the technicality of game mechanics?
I guess quite a lot, in the sense of my own explorations. I don't make a habit of going out and reading other games and kind of looking for mechanical stuff. That said, at some point in doing this, I hit a point where I can't not think that way whenever I encounter a game now. So on the downside, like, there are games I just can't play anymore because mechanically they just look so terrible to me, that I might have been able to enjoy, much to the chagrin of my wife. But
I can't play Parcheesi anymore.
Exactly, it's just terrible. Partly goes back to, again, my early days of gaming, where I just played everything. And so I was just exposed to so many different types of rules and types of games, and different types of games traditionally use different types of rules. And one of the things I think we see now is some of these game developments that you saw mostly in board gaming and maybe a little in role-playing are now filtering back into wargaming. Until 5-6 years ago, or maybe a bit longer, but wargaming was a bit stagnant as mechanically, whereas board gaming had just been tearing off down the track and coming up with all kinds of interesting things. But for whatever reason, that wasn't used in wargaming. And so I've certainly been influenced by that, and just, if not kind of specific mechanics, then kind of ideas of what you can do with mechanics, and how you can not be limited to kind of just what's been seen before in wargaming. So with the Silver Bayonet, when I got to kind of combat, I knew, like, I wanted to slow combat down from where it is in, say, Frostgrave. And Frostgrave, it just kind of happens like that. And that's partly because, it's only a partial focus of that game. That game's about wizards and spellcasters, so the people actually fighting with swords and knives are supposed to settle that really quickly.
Right.
And while I want to keep speed as an overall idea in gaming, I did want to slow the pace down just a little in the Silver Bayonet and give you that kind of more back and forth feeling. At the same time, I absolutely detest games where a guy runs up and, like, hits the other guy with the stick, and then the guy just stands there. And it's just like, it's just so unrealistic, and it's so uncinematic, and I hate it. So I had to have that element of strike back, or at least the optional strike back or the runaway in there. And it also just keeps the other player involved. It gives them a decision to make even while they're being attacked.
That's one of the really enjoyable aspects of I think all your games that do that to a certain extent. Keep the opponent engaged during another player's turn, which
Absolutely.
Some games don't do that at all, right? It's like, I'm going to go get a burger while you do your turn, and then I'll come back. It's interesting you said about the speed, or slowing it down. So now, I'm not a super experienced gamer, which sounds dumb. I mean, I'm really into the hobby, but actually playing games has been, it's hard to get the time to do that. So I don't have a lot of mileage under my belt as far as playing the actual games. But I played some Frostgrave. I really enjoy it, and I just played Silver Bayonet solo scenario. And my takeaway from that game, from my first game of Silver Bayonet, was that it moves faster than Frostgrave. And the reason that I felt it moved faster, one might be a perception, because there is the strike back and back off mechanic, where you're always doing something. So that might be a feeling. But then I think another aspect that I kind of was thinking about was that the lack of magic, or the lack of spells, I mean, other than the occultist, which has the 4 spells, right? But the lack of magic kind of makes the game run a little faster than Frostgrave anyway, just because it doesn't have that aspect to it, which is a whole nother sort of little mini phase. It's not really a phase, but you know what I'm saying? So that was my perception of it.
I think there's a couple of things going on there. One is that your standard Silver Bayonet unit only has 8 guys, which doesn't sound like a huge difference from the 10 you have in Frostgrave, but can actually make quite a difference. Because I've talked to people who are like, oh, Frostgrave takes just a little too long, especially with multiple players, and the easiest way to fix that is reduce the warbands to eight guys, and suddenly you'll find the game moves much faster. And so that's one reason. The other reason for Silver Bayonet is you don't actually have as much back and forth. So in Frostgrave, you've got the 3 phases for the players anyway, where I go, you go, I go, you go, you go during a turn. In Silver Bayonet, you've only got the one player, the other player, back to the first player, which, because you don't have as many guys, doesn't take that long because you don't have that many guys. So that you don't lose that feeling of back and forth, but it does take less time having one player kind of do a bunch of things as opposed to one thing.
Oh, that's true.
So it does mean faster. And and it doesn't have the kind of, what spell shall I cast now? Think. The kind of thinking element, which I do believe is really important for the game. So when I don't want to say that like I took spells out of Frostgrave to make Silver Bayonet because it didn't work like that, but knowing that I didn't have something like spells in Silver Bayonet forced me to think, like, where am I going to have players make a decision in this game? And that's kind of where the fate pool comes in. It's like, this is your resource that you have to decide how to spend. And, but that's a much quicker decision than it is what spell to cast.
I mean, I don't prefer one or the other, but I did really enjoy the 2d10 mechanic with the skill die and a power die. Right. There's just something cool about for those of us that all like rolling dice, we all like rolling dice anyway, and there's just something neat where you're rolling 2 different, they're color coded, you got to keep track of them, but then you can still, the math, it works really easy with it because you're just pulling the totals, right? That's the damage roll.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what your games are kind of famous for, right? The mechanics of single die rolls, you get all your results out of it. But it was fun. We have to touch on this. This is pretty stereotypical for any of your interviews and everything, and it's the idea of cinema in the game, the cinematic quality of the game, which comes from probably that swinginess of the 20 of the 1 to 20 possible roll, right? I think that's super fun. I really enjoy because it was just like every roll. I mean, man, it was just things just that you did not, and it wasn't unrealistic though. That was the cool thing, right? It's like, yeah, you're in a fight. Somebody's got I had wolves that were attacking my characters. They're giant wolves. And it's like, yeah, this character could drop at the, no damage, aced right out of the game, right? Or they turn around and cut one in half. Now, is that something that you were aware was going to happen when you designed, say, Frostgrave, your first game? Or did that happen as you kind of developed the game and you realized, oh, this is a side effect of how I designed the game?
It was certainly a goal. I think there's actually 2 things going on. One is the speed at which it happens. So the fact that your 1 die roll in both Frostgrave and Silver Bayonet is your to hit and damage, different mechanics, but the same result, means that you don't have time to think about what might happen. So say in certain games where you roll to hit and then you roll to ruin, you roll to hit and you're like, I've got a hit. That means I might hurt you. And then I roll to see that. And that pause and that slowing down kills a lot of the cinema feel to it. Because, in the cinema, when somebody pulls out a gun and shoots, except maybe in the Matrix, you don't watch the bullet go really slowly across the screen. It's a bam, they're dead.
Right.
And so some of that speed gets you that. But yeah, also I certainly knew, like, I didn't want to use D6s because they're just too predictable. And that takes some of the fun out of it. Now, I will say that when I came to do Silver Bayonet, I did actually think to myself, I want it to be slightly more predictable than Frostgrave is, because I wanted it to have a little more of that flavor of historical wargaming, which tends to have a lot of that predictability in it because it's trying to recreate. It's a recreation as much as a game. So I said, all right, I'll use 2d10 instead of 1d20, which has a bell curve as opposed to just a wild swing, but it is still pretty swingy. But yeah, I love the unexpected, and that is where narrative comes from. If everything plays out exactly like you expect it, then you might as well not play. And you've seen that story
Correct.
Already.
So, real briefly, you already mentioned that you are making a conscious effort to play more games this year.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, when you're developing either a game system or not a game or whatever, a game or scenarios for a game, do you have someone that helps you test that out? Do you test it yourself? Like, how do you go about like playtesting, Roger?
First off, it is the least enjoyable part of the job, and I suspect that's true of almost everybody. It depends is the real answer. So like now, if I'm writing Frostgrave scenarios, I can just playtest that myself. The rules are so well developed and polished, and I've worked with them so long that I know generally what's going to happen, or not what's going to happen because of the D20, but what could happen, and I feel very comfortable with kind of just checking that myself. Where that changes slightly is in solo scenarios. So for Rangers of Shadowdeep, it's much harder because in a competitive scenario, balance to me just means giving both players equal opportunity to die. Whereas in a solo scenario, you're really balancing it versus how much of the party do I want to die, and that's much harder to kind of figure out. And so usually with that, I've got a few people that I'll send scenarios out to and just say, like, tell me how you did with this, because that's generally what I want to know is how many people died, or if I'm using some kind of mechanic that I've never used before. Yeah, tell me how this worked for you, how that feels. But I keep it to only a very few people these days, people I trust, and people that are good at breaking rules, to be honest. The kind of, in some ways, the people I don't like playing with, because they're like real, like, know the rules lorry types, but they're really good at breaking game systems.
That's like the white hat hackers, right? Test the security system.
Exactly. The difference is when I'm doing an entirely new game system, then I'll have a bigger playtest pool. Like, like this is something I also try to preach. Like, if you're playing a solo game and like you don't like a rule, don't use it.
It wasn't anything about the rules.
Cares.
It was just whether or not I was going to lie to myself about die rolls. I was like, am I going to fudge my own die rolls to my own face? That's ridiculous. I can't do that. Okay. So
depends on the story you want to tell.
Exactly. Oh, I actually kind of want to hear you talk about this a little bit.
Yep.
So it's kind of a combination of it's a single question. I'll pose it in two phrases, I guess. So one is, where do you go? Not physically, but where do you go for inspiration? And two, what is your creative process, but do you have a creative process like that? Like, have you refined down and created like protocols for yourself in order to help you get your work done? But I think successful commercial artists have created, like, they've refined their process to where it's like a thing that they know how to, like, okay, if I need to get into flow, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and now I can do my writing for the day. Do you have that? Have you achieved that for yourself?
For the most part, yes. So I've got kind of a two-part process, I think, which is every morning I get up and do all the things I have to do to get everybody else out of my house, to get the kids off to school, the wife off to work, and then generally I immediately sit down at the computer and start to write. And I'm aiming for about 1,000 words, whatever I'm working on. I don't hold myself too hard to that. If it's a bigger piece that I'm working on all day, bigger, but if it's smaller. But that goes hand in hand with, generally in the afternoon, I go for a long bike ride, about an hour, long, say. And it's during that bike ride that I generally decide, this is what I'm going to write tomorrow. What do I need to know to write that? So if it's a scenario, it's, okay, what does the table look like? What are the special rules that are in play? What kind of special monster do I need to use? So that I've got this picture. I've almost got the movie scene set up in my head, so that by the time I'm sitting down here the next morning, I already know the general outline of it. I've just got to put in the words to fit.
Sure.
And that's great when it works. Sometimes that can roll along for days and days. And then other times it does just fall apart because I'll miss a bike ride, or I'll have a bike ride and I cannot figure it out. Or I just don't know what the next piece is after the bike ride. And then I generally still make myself sit down and try to write 1,000 words, but that's when I'll go like, okay, new magic item time. Stare at the ceiling until I think of one.
Right.
I mean, there's one. And those days aren't as much fun because they tend to take longer. But I still, I still get the work done. And that's the biggest thing. You just got to sit and make yourself do the work.
Sure, of course.
As for where I go for inspiration, I think that goes back to kind of that checking out those books from the library.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I try to go outside of my genre, as it were. So while I read science fiction and I read fantasy and I do draw upon that quite a bit, I also try to make sure I'm reading a lot of things from outside those genres and finding what ideas they're using. Because, like I said, it was like 10 years ago, if you'd just been a war gamer and looking at war games, all you would have produced is another war game exactly like all the ones that have come before. You have to go outside of that if you're going to bring something new back in. That said, and you said not about physical, but I do think there is a big thing of changing your physical location. So, when I was talking about, you got to change your perspective on something, but really the only way to change a perspective is to move, So,
That's a good point.
I try to get out quite a bit, and it really, in some ways, it doesn't even matter what you do when you get out. But obviously, if you've got them, go to museums and go to other free things where you just get to look at stuff. Go to sculpture gardens and just for me, it's go anywhere that might be slightly weird. So living in England, any ruins I can find, I will go to that. Go see weird trees.
Sure.
You have no idea what this will be worth, and it's not like I'm going to go to this weird tree and then I'm going to write a scenario about this weird tree.
Right.
That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to kind of put things in the imagination bank.
I think that's fantastic. I like the idea of the imagination bank. That's a good metaphor, and I love that you do the bike ride. That the bike ride to me is probably a similar thing to some people say they get thoughts in the shower, right? It's just because it's the idea that some part of your conscious brain is focused on something else, right? So it allows. There's something about that. There's something about getting away from the computer, getting away from the piece of paper you're writing on. If you're trying to come up with ideas, it's like they won't manifest till you kind of look away. Then they have a chance to come in there. And that's sort of like a proven mechanic. It's really hard to sum it up, but that's really awesome that you do the bike ride.
They certainly won't manifest while you've got imagination distractions, which basically is the internet.
Right.
If you are looking on Facebook, you are not having any good ideas about anything.
What are you talking about, man? Come on.
But
I've got stock in Facebook.
That is the same part of your brain that's going, I'm entertained. I don't have to think about anything now.
Exactly.
Whereas, if you're doing something physical, that part of your brain that goes, I have to keep us from dying, instead, like is active, but the more imagination part is free to.
Yeah, it's weird, right? Things. It's like that part that's active, it gets out of the way of the imagination part because it gets occupied. So that means that that part of your brain messes with you or gets in your way, by contrast, it gets in your way when you're doing something where you're not occupying it, which is sitting in front of the TV or sitting or whatever. By the way, I don't own stock in Facebook, just to be clear. It was just a joke. I was curious about if you could just briefly kind of tell us about how the layout and graphic design is done for your books. Do you do that stuff, or is that always done by a publisher? But then, of course, you self-published Rangers, right? So did you do that one yourself, or
nope?
Nope.
So nope. So yeah, as Osprey obviously has, paid employees that are really good at that,
sure.
and they do it, and I'm very happy to let them do it. So actually, when I first worked at Osprey, I worked in production and design, which is the department that's in charge of that. And I didn't do that because I did a very little bit of that because I was the lowest level. And I realized I was really bad at it after a while. It takes someone whose like main thing is attention to detail, and that's like the last on my list of things. But so yeah, when it came to so the one time I did it was the first issue of Spellcaster, which is my little kind of magazine I put out. I did my own layout on Word, and it works because it's not meant to be that big a thing. That said, when I came to do Rangers, I was like, this is too big. I can't do that myself, and it'll look absolutely terrible in Word. And so luckily, I had a friend who was a designer because we both worked at Osprey, or at least formerly worked at Osprey. And I basically said, look, I'll cut you in if you do this for me. And I think he did it for me more as a friend favor than thinking he'd actually make any money off it. Luckily, the game hit pretty big, and it probably did become worth his time. But
yeah.
And kind of the same when I started working on issue 2 of Spellcaster, I actually got an email from a fan saying, I'm a graphic designer. Would you like me to do this for you? I was like, you know what? I actually would. And I, I'll cut you in too, because this is no fun at all. Now, for me, now obviously I have a huge advantage. At that point I already had a reputation and I had people who were fans of the game. So they came to me or I could go to them. Whereas if you're just on your own, much, much tougher. And graphic design is expensive if you're going to pay someone to do it. So I don't know. It depends. If you're looking to self-publish, then you just got to really ask yourself what it's worth to you.
So you did Rangers of Shadowdeep, but you've gone back to Osprey. Do you think you would self-publish again? Did you not like that experience? Did you like it, but there's just business reasons that it panned out that you didn't do it again? Or what's your opinion of self-publishing?
So my whole publishing regime is really messy because there's about kind of 3 or 4 different ways I've come to do things. So the Silver Bayonet I wrote as an employee of Osprey. At that time, my job was War Games developer. So Silver Bayonet, while it's my game, is actually owned by Osprey. Whereas Frostgrave, I wrote as a freelancer, so I own Frostgrave. And then Rangers of Shadowdeep, I self-published it and then allowed Modifius to republish it in a traditional print. I actually absolutely loved self-publishing. There's some huge advantages to self-publishing. The biggest being you're only working your own schedule. You only have the editorial oversight you want. Basically, you have complete control if you self-publish. It is yours. You don't have to answer to anybody. You can do whatever you want. And in theory, at least, you get to keep most of the money compared to, say, Osprey, where you're getting a much smaller royalty. But that's because Osprey's thumping up all this money to actually print the book, whereas when I'm self-publishing, I'm either doing it PDF or print on demand, so there is no initial outlay, with the exception being if you're paying the graphic designer, if you're paying the artist, you're going to make those things. Again, got really lucky because I happen to know a really good artist who was willing to work with me and work on it as a kind of co-op thing.
So as far as like Silver Bayonet goes, as far as being a contract for Osprey, the publisher, did that initial contract for that game include the like X number of supplements? Was that originally like at the very beginning, hey, you're gonna write for us the game and X, Y, and Z supplements, or was the supplements or the extra books, did they come up later after the fact of publishing?
Later. In fact, Silver Bayonet was one that I really believed as I wrote it, I'm not going to write any supplements for this. It's going to be one, and I'm going to be done, and I'm not going to go back to it. And, of course, I didn't stick to that very long. Partly because it's just like, man, this is fun. I'm having a lot of fun with this. But also just, like, the enthusiasm for it was so high. And, like, the enthusiasm is infectious. And I thought, man, I want to give players more and more they can play with. So it will be the first game that I've written that. So I've now written one supplement for it, and the second one will be written by somebody else, by Ash Barker.
Interesting.
Hardly because I said I've got too many games now. I can't keep up. I can't continuously write supplements all the time for all of these. But also because, like, you know, Napoleonics or any historical period, I guess. Like, I'm not an expert in Napoleonic history. I'm pretty well read. And I found out what I needed to know. But, so Ash is writing one on Canada, where he lives, and, is Canadian. I've never been to Canada, so it probably is better for him to write that than me. I've never been to most of the places where you can play Silver Bayonet anyway. But, in a broader sense, most game publishers aren't going to want to commit to a supplement because they haven't got the slightest clue how well the game is going to do to begin with. Because most games don't do that well. And that's not even necessarily a shot at the game. Sometimes they just come out at the wrong time. Like when I put out Oathmark and it released on the same month that lockdown happened. It's like, have this mass battle game that you need lots of people to play with. Oh, you can't leave your house. Well...
Yeah, as you say, you said in other interviews, there's a element of luck, certain element of luck in success.
A lot of luck.
I don't even know what time it is. Okay, so we're going pretty long here. I want to speed through these sort of audience questions that they threw up there, just so we cover them.
Okay.
What is it that can? I think you already answered this one. It says, "What is it that can spark I want to make a game about this sort of thing?"
Man, it could be anything. It's. I think you never truly know where the creative spark comes from. Like I said, you're just kind of trying to fill up the tank and then hoping for the rest. And you do practice creativity, but you still never 100% know where it comes from.
Somebody asked this, and I don't have familiarity with the 5 parsecs from home game. I do know what it is, but I haven't played it, so I'm not clear on what this question is, but you might have a better idea. Do you have any interest in designing a multi-path campaign system or a campaign generator like that found in 5 parsecs from home?
Not really. So 5 parsecs uses, I have not read 5 parsecs, but from what I've read about it uses a very procedural generated kind of system where, you roll on a table to find out where you are, what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, and then you kind of play through that. And I get the appeal of that as a player, but as a creator, it's not as interesting to me as constructing grand narratives. So something that I get asked for a lot is, like, for Rangers of Shadowdeep, make a random scenario generator. But to me, while I could do that, the results you get on that are probably never going to be as good as ones I'd purposely designed for all the pieces to fit together. Because here you're getting,
of course,
just a random jumble of pieces that probably you will be able to put together in your imagination, but perhaps aren't smooth,
And it kind of precludes the idea of having a story I mean, like you said, you have to make that story up in your head after you rolled on the tables, but that's completely different from an author creating the story that the scenario is based on. I mean, rolling on tables is always fun, especially in RPGs. You know, we want all kinds of random tables.
It is. Random tables are more fun to roll on than they are to write, though. You know, I say this as someone who's written a D1000 mutation table, but, you know, it can be a pretty dull process.
This next question, I actually, I want to hear the answer to this one a lot myself. How do you determine how many points an ability should cost?
I mean, first off, you have to accept that there's no right answer, because all abilities are going to be situational, and you never know what the situation is going to be for the player. So you're just taking your best guess at the end of the day. You know, if I'm thinking like, how much is the ability to breathe water worth, you know, to breathe in water, then I can just say it's going to be 50 points or whatever. You know, you just pick a number, and then I start looking at, well, is that better or worse than being able to walk on water? You know, like the water breathing is an especially hard one, because if your table doesn't have any water, it's absolutely worthless. But, you know, if it's all water, then it's worth 100%. But right. So like, I guess like, what's the ability to have a +1 attack against undead versus a +1 attack against constructs? And that's literally just comes down to how common are constructs versus how common are undead. Undead are actually slightly more common in Frostgrave, so that ability is worth just slightly more, say 10% more. So the 10-point ability becomes an 11-point ability. And this is one of the reasons writing War Games rules is so hard, because that's fine if you got 2 of these things, but once you have a list of 50 of these things that are all theoretically comparing to each other, you're just trying. And that's one of the ways that playtesting becomes really important, because you will start to learn, like, actually, this ability comes up a lot more than I thought, or doesn't. One of the reasons why I avoid using points as much as possible in my games. One of the reasons that, say, like in Frostgrave, all the soldiers are available to all warbands, as opposed to something like Mordheim, where I've got Chaos and you've got Dwarves and they all have differing abilities. Trying to figure out the relative value of those is almost impossible and guaranteed to create bad matchups and bad situations. Shouldn't to say it isn't fun and can't be fun, but you're asking for it.
Maybe we covered this at the beginning, but what inspired the creation of the Silver Bayonet? Was that assigned to you by someone at Osprey, or was that an idea that you brought to them? And if so, what actually just what was the aha moment where you're like, oh, this is the next thing I'm going to do?
So I was in a strange situation where I basically was going to be employed by Osprey for 6 more months, but I had nothing to do for those 6 months as their war game, because I'd basically finished Oathmark, and knew I was going to go off and become a freelance, but I had to finish out my time. So Phil, who's the head of Osprey Games, said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, give me a minute. I thought about it, and I said, how about Gothic Napoleonic? That just sounds like fun. And he basically said,
cool, all right. So you just pulled it out of your hat.
Go for it.
Just right then.
Give me a good name. And that's another reason why I thought, actually, I was going to be one and done, because I thought I'm going to do that, and then my contract will be done with Osprey, and that's where I'll leave it. But obviously it didn't work out that way. But I wanted to go out kind of merging my time at Osprey, which started when it was really just a military history publisher, and my ending of it, where I was totally involved in games, and seeing if I could merge those things together. And yeah, like I said, the Napoleonic is just the best uniforms, so yeah. That they won.
There we go. Yeah. Okay, last one here is, what's the next destination game-wise, if you can share for us? Things you're thinking about in the future, or are you just going to be like, you're going to have to wait, it's all secrets?
You're going to have to wait. Yeah, because I am currently in negotiation with Osprey for another pretty sizable game. but I don't think it's right to say what that is while I'm in those negotiations. So
even knowing that is that's cool. Just knowing that alone, that you do have another project.
I do, and the great thing is, if it were to all fall apart with Osprey, which it won't, but if it were, I could self-publish it, or I could take it somewhere else, and I feel confident about that. And that's a big game. I've also got another very small game that I'm also hoping to put out through Osprey, that will definitely be a one and done this time, but but a very kind of different thing for me. While I am doing more Frostgrave, and I am doing more Stargrave, and I am doing more Rangers, I also, to keep this fun for me, I have to keep experimenting, and that's why I wrote a Rangers of Shadowdeep role-playing adventure, even though it's not a role-playing game, and why I'm always tinkering with other little bits and doing things, because I got to keep it fresh and interesting for me as well.
It's the best thing to hear right there. Well, dude, thank you so much for hanging out today. I mean,
no problem.
I had a great time.
I bounced around all over your video, but
there's so many of the viewers that get comments all the time when I talk about anything that you've written, and there's definitely a few people that are like, that guy takes my wallet every time. Like, he needs to stop writing stuff. I can't be buying all this stuff. But it's just like, people love your stuff, man. It's super great. It's very, very cool.
I know. I actually do feel guilty about it sometimes, because I am quite like anti-consumer, anti-materialist, but I also just can't stop. I was just having too much fun.
No, never feel bad about that. People always pay for good quality entertainment and art, and that stuff has more value beyond the monetary. If I give you $20 for one of your books, I'm getting way more than $20 of value out of that. Now, I'm not telling you to raise prices. I'm just saying that the intrinsic value is much.
It's 25 now.
Much higher. It's 25. You guys are getting too much fun out of this. Prices are going up.
Exactly.
Well, that was a long one, but I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. I should point out that Joe has been on quite a few podcasts and interviews, and he's covered a lot of the more formative stuff on those, like how he got into game design, how he wrote Frostgrave, etc. So I didn't want to rehash all that. Some quick Google searches will find those for you if you want to hear more about that stuff from the man himself. And linked below, you'll find his website and his blog, which is another great resource for learning more about what he's working on and his design philosophy and his short stories and all kinds of things. All right, you know what I'm going to say. Go ride a bike and get some ideas down. See ya.